General Hospital spoilers for the week of January 12th to 16th reveal that Willow stood in the courtroom, feeling as if time had been stretched into something fragile and distorted, every second dragging out with the weight of an entire season. When the judge finally declared her not guilty, the world did not erupt into relief the way she had imagined in her darkest nights. Instead, everything felt strangely quiet, muted, as if someone had wrapped the moment in thick fog. She felt Drew's hand on her shoulder, steady and warm, carrying his belief that justice had prevailed. But Willow could not shake the heaviness pressing down on her chest. The world saw a woman who had just been freed, but Willow felt like someone who had narrowly stepped past a precipice, only to realize she was carrying a secret that could still drag her back into the abyss. Because beneath the celebration, beneath the smiles, beneath the tears of relief, the truth still sat like a shard of glass buried deep in her conscience. She might have pulled the trigger. Maybe it had been reflex, maybe panic, maybe self-defense. Maybe the only thing she could have done in the moment. But the truth didn't soften. It stayed sharp, unforgiving, and painfully alive inside her. Michael and Jacinda had stepped into the storm with her, offering their loyalty, their testimonies, their willingness to bend the truth to save her. But the lies they told were now circling above them like vultures, waiting for the right moment to descend. Michael had risked everything: his reputation, his future, his standing with his family to shield Willow from the harshest consequences. Jacinda, tangled in the pressure of the investigation and the force of Michael's desperation, had followed suit, adding her own falsehoods to a story already straining under its own contradictions. Both of them now stood on uncertain ground because even if the system declared Willow innocent, that same system could very well crush Michael and Jacinda for their perjury. And that knowledge wrapped itself around Willow like a chain, turning her relief into something twisted, part gratitude, part dread, part unbearable guilt. Assistant District Attorney Turner did not hide her dissatisfaction for long. The moment the verdict was read, she turned her attention from Willow to Michael with a precision that felt almost surgical. Turner was not the kind of woman who accepted closed doors. She pried, she pressed, she dismantled. And if she couldn't win one way, she found another. If she couldn't convict Willow, she would bring down Michael. She would expose every inconsistency, every hesitation in his testimony, every subtle crack in the story he told. But Turner's plans never accounted for Sonny, because Sonny Corinthos was not a man who allowed his family to be threatened without consequence. Turner wanted to unravel Michael's lies, but Sonny was prepared to build walls around him so high and so impenetrable that even the law would struggle to climb them. Every step Turner took toward Michael only created a deeper line in the sand, one Sonny had no hesitation crossing if pushed. Meanwhile, Alexis added another layer of complication to the already volatile situation. With her legal experience, her sharp instincts, and her belief that she could control the narrative, she adjusted statements, directed conversations, and subtly redirected blame in ways that made her look like both a savior and a manipulator. She believed helping Willow was a form of redemption, a way to right past wrongs, to restore some sense of justice she felt she had lost over the years. But in bending the narrative to save Willow, Alexis began creating a precedent that could haunt everyone involved. Her fingerprints on the case could easily be used by Turner as evidence of manipulation, and Alexis knew it, yet she continued pushing, believing that saving Willow was worth the risk even if it meant exposing cracks the prosecution could exploit later. Willow walked out of the courthouse into a wave of applause from supporters who were convinced she had won a clean victory, but the weight in her heart only grew heavier. Every congratulatory smile felt like a reminder of the lie she might be living. Every embrace felt like pressure around her ribs. Every whisper of "you're free" made her feel even more trapped in the fear that the truth would eventually surface. Because secrets do not disappear, they wait. They wait in silence, in the quiet corners of memory, in the moments just before sleep, in the shadows just behind the light. And Willow knew that if the truth emerged, she would not be the only one destroyed. Michael could be prosecuted. Jacinda could lose everything. Alexis could be publicly condemned. Drew could turn against her. And the burden of possibly ruining them all was almost more than she could stand. But even as Willow tried to hold herself together, Turner continued to watch her with the eyes of a predator studying potential movement. Sonny quietly prepared for a war he had already decided he would win. Alexis wove the story tighter, hoping it would hold. Michael and Jacinda balanced on a knife's edge, waiting for the next move. And deep inside, Willow carried the chilling certainty that although she had stepped out of the courtroom as an innocent woman, she was walking into a future where the truth could return at any moment, ready to demand payment for the lie that saved her life. Molly and Cody were slowly stepping into a rhythm that felt almost too simple, too warm, too peaceful for a town like Port Charles. What began as an unexpected bond, a shared sense of comfort, A space to breathe after months of emotional turmoil was turning into something real. Something steady. Something that made Molly believe she might finally be allowed to move forward. Cody, in his awkward sincerity and quiet devotion, offered a kind of gentleness she hadn't felt in a long time. And Molly found herself drawn to that calm, to his way of grounding her when her thoughts spun too fast. They were learning each other's silences, sharing small routines, opening doors to a future both of them were just beginning to admit they wanted. But in Port Charles, peace was always a warning sign, the kind of stillness that appears right before everything shatters. And as much as Molly and Cody were beginning to see the outline of a real relationship forming between them, the truth was that their fragile happiness existed inside a bubble that was already stretching too thin. According to the hints coming out of General Hospital, trouble was heading straight for them, trouble neither of them saw coming. Trouble that had a name Molly once thought she had already closed a chapter on. TJ. TJ's return was not just a simple homecoming, it was a collision waiting to happen. He was coming back carrying a weight Molly didn't yet understand. A storm of emotions he had been holding onto since everything fell apart. And the moment he stepped back into Port Charles, the past Molly thought she had locked behind closed doors would begin to push its way forward again. TJ hadn't forgotten what they had, and more importantly, he hadn't let go of the pain that came after. The silence between them, the silence Molly tried to fill with new beginnings, was still screaming in TJ's mind, and his return meant confronting everything left unresolved. As Molly leaned more deeply into her growing connection with Cody, TJ's shadow started creeping back into her thoughts, uninvited and impossible to ignore. His name alone stirred memories she had tried to bury, and with him on the way home, those memories were about to collide with the present she was trying to build. Cody, unaware of the emotional landmine about to explode beneath them, continued offering Molly the steadiness she desperately needed. But even he would start to sense a shift once TJ appeared. Because TJ's arrival wasn't just a complication, it was the ignition of an old obsession. A new shock descending into the quiet Molly and Cody had found together. TJ was returning with questions, unresolved emotions, and a determination that could disrupt everything. He wasn't ready to let Molly go. Not after the love they shared, not after the way things ended. And whether he intended to or not, his presence would begin to pull Molly in different directions, stirring guilt, longing, confusion, and a fierce internal conflict she wasn't prepared to confront. The peace she found with Cody would begin to fracture under the weight of what she still felt, or feared she still felt for TJ. And that was a true danger, not that TJ would fight for her, but that Molly would realize she was not as far from the past as she pretended to be. The emotional shock of his return would ripple through every part of her life, feeding into her fears, her unresolved wounds, and the pressure she kept hidden beneath calm smiles. What seemed like the beginning of a sweet, healthy love story with Cody was now standing on unstable ground, threatened by a history powerful enough to shake both of them. Cody and Molly were savoring their fragile peace. But if they knew what was coming, if they understood the storm TJ was bringing back with him, they would realize this quiet moment wasn't the start of something new. It was the calm before their entire world cracked open. Tracy left the confrontation with Alexis feeling as if someone had ripped open an old wound she had spent years learning to ignore. The humiliation ran deeper than the moment itself. It tapped into her lifelong conviction that she was always one step ahead, always a woman who saw through the game long before anyone else even realized they were playing. But Alexis had outmaneuvered her not by force, not by intimidation, but by slipping quietly beneath Tracy's defenses and extracting a confession. Before Tracy even realized she had been manipulated, that realization settled in her stomach like a burning stone, heavy and impossible to ignore. The image of Alexis' calm, almost clinical expression as she guided Tracy toward the admission replayed again and again in her mind, each iteration fueling the wildfire of fury that was quickly consuming every rational thought. Tracy Quartermaine had suffered public embarrassments before. She had faced boardroom coups, family betrayals, romantic disasters, legal entanglements, and even deathbed confessions that shattered the illusion of stability she clung to. But being outsmarted, being tricked was something she did not tolerate. And now Alexis had done exactly that. She had forced Tracy to admit she had seen Michael outside Drew's house, exploiting that admission to push Tracy into testifying, pushing her into becoming the very thing she despised, a pawn in someone else's strategy. It wasn't the testimony itself that enraged Tracy. It was the loss of control. Tracy's identity had been built on the idea that she dictated the battlefield. Yet here she was, shoved into a corner, exposed, utilized, and discarded all in the same breath. Alexis had walked away looking triumphant, as though she had simply acted in the name of justice. But Tracy knew better. Alexis Davis rarely played a move that wasn't also designed to satisfy her own internal hunger. The hunger for power, for redemption, for self-righteous victory. and Tracy could smell that hunger as clearly as she could smell betrayal. So as she sat alone later that evening, glass of bourbon trembling slightly in her hand, Tracy made herself a silent vow. Alexis would pay for this. Not in anger alone. Anger burned fast and foolish, but with calculation, with patience, with every ounce of strategic brilliance Tracy possessed. Revenge wasn't simply a reaction. For her, it was an art form. And Alexis had just volunteered to become the next canvas. But Alexis wasn't the only one Tracy was ready to pull into the fire. Martin's involvement trial, or imagined flicked like a warning light in the back of her mind. She had no evidence yet that he had provided Alexis with the information about Michael. But the possibility alone was enough to put him in danger. Tracy knew Martin too well. He was slippery when cornered, evasive when pressured. And he had a long history of playing both sides when it benefited him. If she managed to convince herself that Martin had been whispering in Alexis' ear, feeding her just enough information to dismantle Tracy's stance, then his fate was sealed. Tracy had a way of taking suspicions and turning them into certainties, and certainties into retribution. Martin, for his part, felt the change in the air even before Tracy made a move. He sensed her eyes on him in the courthouse, sharp and accusatory, as though she could already see through him. He wasn't guilty not this time, but innocence didn't matter when someone like Tracy was looking for a target to strike. He knew she would start digging. She always did. And once she started, she rarely stopped until she found something she could use. Martin knew enough about her history to understand one terrifying truth. Sometimes Tracy didn't need real evidence to destroy someone. Suspicion alone was enough fuel. Meanwhile, Alexis tried to bury the discomfort that had begun to tug at the edges of her confidence. When she urged Tracy into that admission, she believed she was choosing the lesser evil, choosing the route that protected Willow, exposed buried inconsistencies, and forced Michael's role in the case to come to light. Alexis had always prided herself on her ability to navigate the complicated moral landscape of Port Charles. She was the kind of woman who carried her own scars openly, using them as fuel to make the tough decisions others refused to confront. But the victory didn't feel clean. It felt contaminated. She told herself she was driven by justice, by her desire to safeguard Willow, by her instinct to preempt further manipulation in the courtroom. But beneath that justification, something darker stirred, a familiar obsession, a compulsion to reshape narratives, to force the truth into the light even when doing so meant crushing everything standing in its way. Alexis convinced herself she was doing what needed to be done. But a small voice within her kept whispering that she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She had trapped Tracy, trapped Michael, trapped Martin, perhaps inadvertently, perhaps intentionally. And now the walls of the story she had rewritten were beginning to pulse and bend, threatening to fall inward on everyone involved. Michael, whose presence outside Drew's home was now crystal clear fact, felt the pressure building around him. He had underestimated Alexis. He had underestimated how messy the situation would become once Tracy spoke. And now the tightening noose around him was no longer about the case itself, it was about the lies, the omissions, the fragments of truth that had splintered into dangerous pieces. Every step he took now seemed to echo, as if the ground was preparing to crack beneath him. Turner was watching him. Alexis had shifted the spotlight onto him, and Tracy's fury was just beginning to build. As the days unfolded, Alexis felt the weight of Tracy's vengeance looming like a storm cloud on the horizon. She could feel Martin's unease growing, could see Michael's unraveling edges, could sense Turner sharpening her focus on the shifting testimonies. The story Alexis crafted, a story she believed would protect Willow, was now spiraling beyond her control. And the most terrifying part was recognizing that she might have unleashed something she couldn't contain. Tracy wasn't just angry. She was mobilizing. Martin wasn't just nervous. He was preparing for impact. Michael wasn't just threatened. He was on the brink. And Alexis, standing at the center of the chaos she had orchestrated, found herself confronting the chilling realization that the truth she forced into daylight was only the beginning of a much darker reckoning. In Port Charles, stories didn't stay fixed. They shifted, twisted, grew teeth, and this one was about to bite. Sidwell had always possessed a talent for slipping into the cracks of people's fears, and Laura knew it better than anyone. So when word reached him that she had sent Kevin and Ace all the way to Dublin, his reaction was as predictable as it was unsettling. He wouldn't rage, he wouldn't lash out. Sidwell preferred something quieter, more poisonous, a mocking smile, the kind that made it clear he saw right through her efforts to keep her family safe. He would likely laugh in that low, dismissive way of his and remark how unfortunate it was that Laura had been forced to ship her husband and grandson halfway across the world, as though their distance were nothing more than an amusing inconvenience. But underneath that mocking tone would be a message. No matter how far she sent them, no matter how carefully she built walls around the people she loved, Sidwell would always be able to find a way through. Distance meant nothing to a man who thrived on control. Laura could already feel the thread tightening around her like a noose. She had acted out of necessity. Kevin and Ace could not be allowed to remain within Sidwell's reach. But she also knew Sidwell well enough to understand that he did not accept obstacles. He simply rerouted his cruelty elsewhere. And if he truly wanted to get to Kevin and Ace, he wouldn't let a transatlantic divide stop him. That was exactly the kind of message he would deliver to her later. Perhaps with that chilling smirk that always seemed to imply he was 5 steps ahead of everyone else. But Sidwell did not stop there. Protecting Kevin and Ace only redirected his attention to another vulnerable point in Laura's life, Charlotte. It would be almost effortless for Sidwell to hint just subtly enough to terrify her. That Charlotte was on his radar now. A new pawn to pressure her with. And the possibility that he might target Danny Morgan as well, dragging an innocent teenager into his power games, made Laura's stomach twist painfully. Sidwell would savor showing her that she wasn't just protecting to loved ones. She was protecting an entire network of people he could exploit. That was how men like him operated. Not with brute force, but by tightening fear around the throat of anyone who dared push back. Laura lived with this fear every hour of every day, even as mayor, even as someone who had battled warlords, mobsters, tyrants, and madmen across her lifetime. Sidwell unnerved her in ways she rarely admitted aloud. He was not chaotic, he was calculated, and that made him infinitely more dangerous. But she was not facing him alone. Sunny had stepped into the line of fire with her, and the two of them had formed a reluctant but determined alliance. Laura brought strategy, empathy, and civic power. Sunny brought connections, muscle, and a willingness to dive into moral gray areas Laura normally avoided. Together, they were the only force in Port Charles capable of turning Sidwell's psychological warfare back against him. They both understood that the key to destabilizing Sidwell lay not in brute confrontation, but in exploiting the one vulnerability he had accidentally exposed: his entanglement with Lucy and Ava. A man like Sidwell believed he could keep every plate spinning without consequence. But Sunny and Laura had seen enough messy triangles to recognize an opening when they saw one. Sunny understood desire, pride, jealousy, and ego more intimately than most people in town. He could predict how a man like Sidwell would behave when caught between two women, who each believed they held a special place in his life. Laura, meanwhile, knew exactly how to gather information, subtly probe private loyalties, and quietly feed doubt into the places Sidwell assumed were secure. Their combined strategy was simple: let Sidwell's own affairs become the rope that choked him. But what neither of them anticipated was a new variable entering the board: Charlotte and Danny, forming a plan of their own. Teenagers rarely understood the danger they were walking into, especially when fueled by loyalty, fear, or a desire to reclaim power they felt slipping away. According to the whispers from GH, these two young, impulsive, and far braver than they should be were about to take matters into their own hands. They may have believed they were helping Laura or protecting their families, but in Sidwell's eyes, initiative like that made them perfect targets. He didn't care about innocence. He cared about leverage. And Danny Morgan, with his last name, his lineage, and his relationship with Jason, was one of the most potent pieces of leverage in Port Charles. Laura sensed this before anyone else did, the way the shadows seemed to stretch. When Sidwell's name came up, the way Charlotte grew restless, the way Danny began asking too many questions, it terrified her. Because while adults like Laura and Sunny had faced monsters before, and learned to navigate their cruelty, the teenagers in their orbit had not. Sidwell would use them without hesitation, not because he wanted to harm them specifically, but because harming them would hurt everyone else more deeply. That was Sidney Sidwell's art. He didn't just threaten individuals, he threatened the foundations of relationships, families, stability, hope itself. So Laura found herself caught between the quiet dread of waiting for Sidwell's next move, and the fierce resolve of a mother, grandmother, and leader who refused to let him win. She and Sunny continued piecing together their counter-strike, aware that every art counted, aware that every conversation, every whisper, every shift in Sidwell's behavior could signal the beginning of a new level of danger. Sidwell had become an obsession for both of them, not because they wanted it, but because fighting him had become necessary. Laura wasn't simply reacting anymore, she was preparing for war. And somewhere in the middle of all this, Charlotte and Danny charted their own secret path, unaware that their every step was leading them closer to Sidwell's line of sight. The plan Laura and Sunny crafted was meant to protect Port Charles, but the truth was darker, more complicated. Their fight was becoming a psychological maze, an intricate battle of wills, and Sidwell thrived in that environment. This wasn't just a rivalry, it was an obsession unfolding on both sides. An obsession, in Port Charles, always meant someone would eventually pay a devastating price. Jason had grown so accustomed to living in the shadows of danger, loyalty, and sacrifice that the idea of a simple date, just an evening free from bloodshed, secrets, and impossible choices felt almost foreign to him. But when the opportunity presented itself, when the idea of inviting Britt into a moment of calm crossed his mind, it left an unexpected feeling in his chest, something softer than he allowed himself to feel for a long time. Sooner than anyone expected, the invitation was sent, understated yet sincere, carrying more weight than Britt could have imagined. And once Britt received it, her heart responded before her mind did. There was something in Jason's presence that pulled her in, something steady, something protective, something that promised both danger and refuge in equal measure. So the question wasn't really whether she wanted to accept, it was whether she dared to. Britt had known heartbreak. She had known the burden of her family name, the shadow of her past, the consequences of her actions. She had rebuilt herself more times than she cared to count. And yet, Jason had been one of the rare people who looked at her and saw something more than her mistakes. He saw the woman she was trying to become. That alone was enough to shake her resolve, enough to complicate the decision in front of her. Because saying yes to Jason didn't just mean agreeing to a romantic evening, it meant opening a door she had sworn she would keep closed. A door filled with possibilities that frightened her as much as they thrilled her. But deep down, Britt knew she would say yes. The moment she read Jason's message, the moment she felt the warmth spreading through her chest, she knew this wasn't something she could walk away from. Jason Morgan didn't ask for much, not emotionally, not personally, not romantically. He was a fortress of controlled silence, a man who rarely allowed softness into his life. So the fact that he reached out at all meant more than Britt could admit, even to herself. Accepting his invitation wasn't just agreeing to a date. It was acknowledging that the connection between them was real, undeniable, and growing stronger with every passing day. As the anticipation built, Jason found himself confronting a truth he hadn't expected. The evening he was planning wasn't just a date. It was something else, something bigger, something he had been carrying quietly, a thought he had buried deep beneath duty and danger. The one that refused to stay hidden now that Britt was back in his life. He didn't just want to spend an evening with her. He wanted a future, a real one. And that realization was as terrifying as it was electrifying. Because proposing to someone meant believing he deserved something more than the world he had been chained to for years. Jason had always been decisive in matters of life and death. But vulnerability was another battlefield entirely. Still, the more he imagined Britt's smile, her laugh, the way she challenged him, the way she softened around him, the more certain he became. This was his chance. His moment to reclaim a piece of humanity he thought he had lost. Britt brought out a side of him that had been dormant, a warmth, a gentleness, a desire to live rather than merely survive. And as dangerous as Port Charles could be, as unpredictable as their world was, Jason understood that life was too fragile to wait for perfect timing. Britt, meanwhile, sensed that Jason's invitation carried a gravity she couldn't fully explain. There was something in the air, something charged, something electric, something that felt like the beginning of change. She didn't know yet that Jason was considering a proposal, but her instincts were whispering that the night ahead would not be ordinary. It would be transformative. And with that awareness came a flood of fears she thought she had dealt with long ago. Could she let herself trust this? Could she risk her heart again? Could she allow herself to believe she deserved a love that wasn't built on lies, manipulation, or tragedy? Yet even with the fear, the truth glimmered beneath her uncertainty. She wanted Jason. Not the version of him the town whispered about. Not the enforcer. Not the legend. But the man who looked at her and saw someone worth choosing. Someone worth fighting for. As their evening approached, Port Charles continued swirling with chaos, legal battles, shifting alliances, dangerous threats looming over every corner. But for a brief moment, Jason carved out a space untouched by darkness. A moment he intended to fill with honesty, hope, and a question that could change everything. The proposal wasn't planned in a traditional way. Jason didn't rehearse words, didn't imagine speeches, didn't try to craft a perfect narrative. That wasn't who he was. Instead, his decision formed quietly, like a heartbeat growing stronger with each passing day. He would ask Britt not because it was safe, but because it was real. Because for the first time in a long time, he wanted something that wasn't tied to violence or obligation. He wanted someone to choose him back not for protection or necessity, but for love. And that desire, the simple, profound desire to build something with Britt, ignited what would become one of the most explosive, emotional arcs Port Charles had seen in months. His proposal wouldn't just be a surprise. It would send shockwaves through the people who believed Jason would never let anyone get that close again. It would shift dynamics, create jealousy, raise questions, and force long-buried emotions to the surface. Britt's answer, whatever it would be, had the power to reshape more than their lives. It would ripple through Sunny, Carly, Elizabeth, Sam, Maxie, and everyone who had ever crossed paths with Jason's guarded heart. And as the night drew near, as Jason prepared to step into the most vulnerable moment of his life, one truth became undeniable. This wasn't just a date. It was the beginning of an emotional explosion, one that no one in Port Charles would see coming.